Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Naropa. I mean, most of you live here, but it was more so to welcome myself. So welcome, Lama Rod, to Naropa. It's such an honor. I mean, it's an honor and a privilege to be here with your community. I feel like it's like coming home in a way. Just walking around campus lost. Um, I was like, it's so colorful, and all these Tibetan prayer flags. I was getting flashbacks from my monastery years. But that's a great thing. That's a good thing. But just being here at this place where I've heard so much about for many, many years, and being also a student of Trungpa Rinpoche and how his writings really actually gave me a voice to start interpreting my experiences of Buddha Dharma into a context that was authentic to me. So I'm really appreciative for that. I'm really appreciative of the work that this university is doing. And I've had so many friends who have graduated from Naropa, and I'm really, interested in seeing if everything they've told me is actually true. Because these friends are very weird. Some of them I studied with at Harvard, and they were like, "Oh, you're very different. Where did you go to undergrad?" And they're like, "Naropa." It's like, oh, I need to go there and experience this. So this is really wonderful. Thank you, and to be receiving this lectureship is quite wonderful. Listening to Janine, read the names of the people who've been honored with this, this position. I just think that it's like almost not okay for me to be here. Like, I haven't done anything, I'm not Jan Willis or Sharon Salzberg or Reverend Angel, but I just kind of do what I feel called to do, which is basically disrupt. And I don't do it on purpose, it just happens. I just kind of sit down and just really say the first thing that comes to my mind. And then people give me money. So, and I thought, what a perfect profession to go into, where I can say whatever I want. This didn't even happen with activism. I was like, I say whatever I want and get escorted out. And then I come to places like this and say the same thing, and people are like, can we give you stuff? Can we give you money and chocolate? And yeah, I get chocolate. Buddhists love to give chocolate away. They're like, I don't have money for you, but I have this bar of chocolate. Actually, last week, I worked with a lot of activists, and we were doing a group together on anger. And someone comes up to me after the group. He was like, I don't have any money, but I have this $5 chocolate bar, and I want to exchange that for the teachings. I was like, I'd rather have the $5, but you can't. Someone's being generous. You have to be open and accepting and gracious. So you have to go, because we're Buddhists. It gets in the way sometimes. Last night, I got to the hotel and reminded myself that indeed there is a topic for today. And then I got very busy trying to figure out what that was. But it's happiness, So I'm really happy to be talking about happiness, even though it's a very difficult period for me right now. And I can just talk about that a little bit. I'll be talking about it more tomorrow night at the lecture, because it fits more into my work around the dialogue between love and anger and rage. So I was thinking, walking from the car, and I got lost, and I was just sitting there thinking, God, it's so ironic that I'm going to go give a talk about happiness, and I kind of feel like crap. But that's very interesting to say that, and it became a moment of teaching for me when I was like, you know what? Happiness abides with something else. Happiness is never like alone, and I think sometimes when we think about happiness, it's like, well, I can only be happy. There's only this experience of happiness, but if we're really living our lives and being in tune to what we're experiencing, there's happiness that begins to surround the struggle. So I'm always struggling. I'm always trying to make sense of the world. I'm always trying to figure out why I have to endure the kinds of violence that I endure each and every day. I'm also trying to figure out how I can be such an agent of violence as well in the ways that I find myself being. And then all of that is related to happiness because, happiness doesn't completely disrupt violence. But it can be there. And it makes everything really complex. And the ways in which we're really struggling to oversimplify everything, is really an issue for us. And I think that happiness is something that I think in mainstream communities, it's so oversimplified. And so when I go into communities and I talk about happiness, particularly not necessarily Buddhist communities, but more secular communities, and I say happiness, and people are like, oh, we don't want to hear that. We're not interested in happiness. And then that's a moment for me to go, I think I have to complicate this a little bit, and this is what I do. Because when I say happiness, I actually am trying to communicate what my history is with this way of being that I've actually had to earn. And that this way of being is not the absence of the struggle, of the sadness, of the hopelessness. It is within it. The happiness holds the hopelessness, the sadness. It holds the ways in which I feel alone and distant. And it's because of happiness that helps me to turn my attention and to abide within the things that don't feel so good. So much of that is the work. I think sometimes in our circles, in Buddhist circles or in contemplative circles, where, we pronounce happiness as being this thing, and that we perform happiness in so many ways when that experience of happiness isn't actually something that is authentic to us. So much of what I experience in terms of the fruits of Dharma practice and meditation, all the stuff I've had to earn and sacrifice for. Dharma has never really been given to me. Dharma isn't something that I just kind of wear, and sashay around, and wearing all of my, beads and malas and my stones, and all my patchwork, colorful clothes. I'm actually not into like colorful clothes because, black is the thing that I like to do. Anyhow, just to put that out there because people are like, you don't look like a Lama, and I'm like, well, you don't either. So, so what does a Lama look like? That's a whole nother talk. We'll talk about that tomorrow night. So the earning, so it's just everything that I've experienced, I've had to earn. I've had to sit through the struggle. I've had to sit through the pain. I've had to leave. I've had to go off into the wilderness. I've had to be in silence. I've had to fast. I've had to do all manners of austerities. But if you're not willing to engage in that struggle, that journey, then you won't be earning it. If the Buddha had to do it, probably we have to do it too. More than likely. So for me, happiness is this experience of contentment, of connectedness, of balance. When I say happiness, I'm not actually necessarily referring to this euphoric experience. This, as I like to say, not the kind of the Disney kind of happiness where you're just skipping down the road and humming a melody and the sun is out and it's raining candy, you which is what most people think. They're like, oh, that's what happiness is: rainbows and unicorns, and peppermints and chocolate, which is great. But that's one level of happiness that I'm not so interested in. I'm actually interested in this level of happiness that actually is about us just being in our bodies, being connected, being sensitive, being in tuned. It is not this thing where we're forcing anything away. It's not the manifestation of aversion where we're pushing things away, but it's this profound and revolutionary kind of allowing and accepting, not condoning, not celebrating, but allowing. It's there already. How can I do the work of allowing it to be there? And when I do the work of allowing something to be there, then I begin to enter into this really beautiful relationship with what is. I don't have to like it. I don't like the shit that I have to deal with. It's not like, this is not the source of happiness for me. It's the energy of allowing it to be there. And once I allow it to be there, then I begin the work of what my Dharma has taught me to do, which is to see into the nature of these things, which I habitually avoid. What is the nature? We talk about Mahamudra. What is the nature of Mahamudra? What is the nature of mind itself? The things that I can't stand are just the conflation of emptiness and potential, that I've been manipulating to give rise to something that I have a negative attitude towards. So when I pull my Dharma into it, when I pull my experience of Mahamudra into that, then it begins to reveal something very different, and then happiness deepens and intensifies. Again, it's not this feeling of euphoria, but this feeling of just being there. We're not bullshitting ourselves. And we get into these really intense habits of bullshitting ourselves. I should say that again. We get into these really intense habits of bullshitting ourselves, because the more you talk back to me, I'm going to start thinking this is church. Don't feed back anything, because my mom was a preacher. I grew up with this. So you start talking to me, I'm going to start talking back. I don't know if y'all can handle this at Naropa. This is what I love about, Professor Jan Willis. It's like, yeah, let's have church. We get together like, yeah, let's have church. This is where we come from. This is where Black people come from. Many of us, not all of us, but many of us, come from this place of like the Black prophetic tradition, the Black vocal tradition, where, and this is why, okay, I get into tangents, so I need to bookmark my place. So I was just talking about happiness and Mahamudra, so I'm going to bookmark that and just say briefly that being embodied in the way that I am, I bring my culture, I bring my ancestors into Dharma, which is why I just kind of naturally begin to disrupt things, because my ancestors sit with me. They may not get this. They may not get like all this, but they know like that I'm trying to bring something to the world that's revolutionary and radical and authentic, And so when I give Dharma talks, it's really remembering that I come from a line of people where we were in communication with one another, in dialogue, and we were expressing joy together. And it wasn't about me just sitting here being quiet and passive. You just sitting there being quiet and passive. It became this community where we're feeding each other, So feel free to, I say all that to say to feel free for, all of my people of color in here, in particular of African descent, go back, just give me something, So go back to the, amen, all right now. All right, so bookmark, going back to the bookmark. So when we actually begin to bring our Dharma and our awareness into the things that we habitually avoid, it transforms. And then we stop bullshitting ourselves, And it doesn't become it actually becomes something that's a lot more messier, uneven, unkept. And we love to clean up stuff in our circles. We love to present a really finished product. And, part of the experience that I'm going through right now is to learn how to fall apart, because I've been playing into ways of being a teacher that is no longer serving me, And I'm not actually interested, in actually fulfilling anyone's expectations. First and foremost, you need to fulfill your own expectations. As Audre Lorde wrote, let me start quoting scripture, and as Audre Lorde wrote, it's so self-care is self-preservation. Self-preservation is an act of political warfare. And so how do I allow myself to be myself in public, and how does that become self-preservation, which in turn becomes a way in which I wage war against hegemony and white supremacy and patriarchy and misogyny, capitalism, ableism, So there's happiness there. So the happiness is surrounding that. Yeah, there's an edge there, there's aggression, there's anger, but there's also this kind of deep contentment that grows deeper once we start articulating where we're at. And that happiness is also directly related to the space. You can't do the dance without space. Wherever dance you want to do, you can't do it without the space. And happiness helps us to give rise to that spaciousness. Or vice versa, the space gives rise to happiness, or happiness gives rise to space. However you want to think about that relationship. It's a different kind of happiness than what we're always trying to process in our mainstream communities, in our secular communities. It's not about this skipping around, sashaying, and laughing all the time. It's actually about this deep connectedness. And that deep connectedness is this feeling of being deeply, deeply fed, deeply nourished, of feeling safe. So happiness is all of that. Happiness is, again, for me, not the absence of, but the inclusion of. So therefore, happiness doesn't become this thing in which I used to colonize other people with in other communities. Happiness doesn't become this end product that I manipulate in order to get people to forget that they are indeed oppressed. And this is particularly my work within secular mindfulness. I've been told that I don't really teach secular mindfulness. Again, I just show up and say I'm teaching mindfulness and just do whatever I want. And then people come up to me and they're like, that was wonderful. I don't think that was mindfulness. I was like, I think you're right. You're right. So we have to be very careful about how we begin to occupy this place of what happiness is and how we try to force that onto folks, particularly if we're coming from a position of power, and are coming from an intersectionality in which we are distant or more distant from experiences of oppression and marginalization. Because there's a different understanding of happiness if you've been born into a particular life experience and body where you haven't had to deal with the fact that you've been queer or of color or poor, or a gender that is not within a dominant gender, there's a different experience of happiness, and that in one way I think there is much more work for us to do who are within those intersections that are much more kind of geared towards oppression and marginalization. Our happiness in the context in which I'm using it for those of us in that realm, that kind of happiness, if we're entering into spaces where we're told to be happy, our happiness has to go through our social suffering. We can't go over it. We can't go around it. We can't go under it. And there was a children's story that I was just in Shambhala, Atlanta, last weekend, and we talked about this, and I keep forgetting the story. The bear and the log, the bear hunt. Bear hug, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you can't go around it. So that's the same thing with suffering and moving into happiness. You can go around the material itself. You can go around this really critical data. Again, as Audre Lorde said, that like all of this stuff, our emotions, this material is full of data. And she was thinking particularly about anger, but anger is also right there. Talk about that more tomorrow. I don't want to like give you all of my material right now. So we use that data in order to understand who we are and where we're going, and to understand ultimately the nature of what we've been manipulating. And then once we understand the nature of it, then we become empowered. So when I'm working in these mindfulness spaces, teaching something I think is mindfulness, what I'm actually doing is supporting people, encouraging people to move into understanding the data. The data that they have never gotten because they're really busy avoiding it. So we move into that realm and we're trying to figure out, what is this? How is this? To what extent is this? And then so much of our agency is derived from how we begin to develop a relationship to the things that we avoid. There's no agency unless you begin to get feedback from the environment, from our minds, from the things we avoid. If we're not doing that, then we waste material. We waste these things in our mind. We waste the things we have aversions to, because these things are teaching us. If we don't get the lesson, then we don't get the fruition, which is the experience of happiness, of contentment, of connectedness, of acceptance. But our minds, and so in one way, if I think really relatively, our minds are actually just mirroring everything. So whatever we're doing in our minds, we're doing in our relationships. If I'm avoiding something in my mind, I'm avoiding something in my life. Often the thing that I'm avoiding, not always, but sometimes what we're avoiding is just relationships, people. Because you remind me of the thing I'm trying to get around. So you try to go over them, you try to go under them, try to go around them. Where in fact, and indeed, the path is straightforward, including trauma. Even our trauma, we have to go into the trauma in order to figure out what it's telling us, and ultimately how to let it go, how to move through it. Releasing that trauma is actually this experience, for me, that has been of a kind of happiness. Until we learn how to move into relationship to these things, we pack it away. It's like Jung and talking about the shadow. For me, it's like the closet. So some of us come out the closet, but we leave our shit in there. And so it's great to come out. It's wonderful. Don't get me wrong. Like, let's do that. But at some point you have to go back and unpack that. Because some of us get real confused. Now, this is for my, queer folks in the room. Like sometimes we get real confused and we say we come out of the closet and we're like, and I don't have any more work to do. I'm, whatever. I'm queer, I'm trans, I'm whatever. That's wonderful and I celebrate that. But then what's next? Does that mean that like I can't at all ever be an oppressor, an agent of violence? So we hit these huge milestones, but always remember there's more work to do. There's more work to go back into that closet and do the work of unpacking, always. And then there are some of us, who are saying, I've done all of my work. Meanwhile, there are a lot of people telling you that you are not doing your work. And then somehow you privilege your own experience over the immense amounts of feedback you're getting from those around you. Then you become work for people, Not only do you have work to do, you are work. And then that's like worse. Someone has to do you, and then you have to do yourself. There's a lot happening with that. But I want to, again, so I'm never, this whole thing, I forgot to tell you all this. You're not going to feel better after this. Not going to feel better. You're not going to feel, maybe you may feel it more ease, like this word we like to use in our circles, be at ease. I'm like, I'm not even interested in that. Like, I just gave up. I gave up years ago. I was like, I don't want to do this. But a lot of like Dharma teachers and spiritual leaders, they're like, oh, if I don't make people feel happy, they won't support me. Again, I found the trick to that. I make people feel worse, and then they feel indebted. I'll be writing a book about that and doing a series of workshops. But it's so, I can only talk about a Dharma that I practice. And I never, ever practiced a Dharma that was about bypassing. So I came into Dharma practice because of incredible suffering, because of incredible trauma, depression, and that's what spurred me into sitting my ass on the cushion. And I haven't been able to figure out a way around that. I haven't been able to figure out a shortcut. I've tried very hard. Then, I drank the Kool-Aid and went into a 3-year retreat and sat in a box and cried for 3 years. And still, I couldn't find a shortcut around that. I was crying and I was like, I need to find a way out of this. And then you just move through and your relationship changes. So, some of my friends on other spiritual paths are like, oh, Buddhists are so intense. You're like, you start with suffering, and it's not that like, we do actually start with suffering, right? We do, but we don't stay there. We begin to see suffering, discomfort, dukkha, as something to metabolize, to transform into wisdom. This is what our project really is. Taking the whatever, the messiness, the dirtiness, and transforming it into clarity. Taking the darkness and seeing the light in it. But we have to be very careful, again, going back to this, how we use happiness as this thing to colonize. To tell people, well, you should be doing this, and if you don't do this, then you're wrong, and we're going to force you into this. We have to be very careful and to practice a kind of sensitivity and openness that says that, what, people are trying to be free, in a wide range of circumstances. So we're just kind of sashaying around judging people. As my teacher, Lama Rod Owens, used to say all the time, you should turn that judgment around and ask yourself, where are you falling short? And to allow people to be sad, too. Like, we're so uncomfortable with sad people. We are uncomfortable with ourselves, and so often with me, it's like, I don't want to talk about my sadness because I don't want you to force me to be different, because my sadness is important. It's as important as my happiness and my joy. My sadness, my hopelessness, my trauma, my anger and rage, all of that is so important to me, and how dare you try to take that away from me? You have to own that. And this is what we're going through, with our activist community right now in Boston that I work with. Is like, and this was something they like brought me back. They were just like, oh, because I was trying to, run some of this propaganda, on them, and activist communities are like, oh, sure. What's that again? What's up? And so what we actually, as a community began to figure out, was like, oh, you know what, we have to own our stuff. We just can't bypass it and see it as an experience, which is where I always go to, oh, this is just an experience. But we own it. I am sad. We start there because we have been so disenfranchised from our emotional reality. And so you have to start with claiming it again. And then you begin to understand the nature of it. You begin to understand the significance of it. Then you begin to see it as an experience that's separate from self. So I think I'll just kind of slow down a little bit to start dialogue. Because I know I would rather have a dialogue than me sitting here talking and spreading this propaganda. This isn't interesting. You get this all the time in class. This is a Buddhist college. I went, Harvard for, graduate school, and so it's like I was in Buddhist classes. You couldn't even say Buddhism. They're like, what is this Buddhism that you're talking about? Oh, oh, I see. So how should we do this? Yeah. If I get a second breath, it's going to be another hour.
Not your huge dialogue, but what you would like to talk about.
You can also compliment me as well. You can just do that. You don't need a question, actually. Hi.
They always make this for people that are 6 feet tall. It's okay. Hi. I'm Barb Catlagan. We just met.
Mm-hmm.
So my question for you is this, Lama Rod. First, thank you. All you're talking about sadness, just and being in it, and makes me smile.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So here's my question. As we go through the process of holding all this and doing all this work, in your estimation, where does forgiveness have a place in here, and where is it? What is it?
Absolutely, thank you. I think forgiveness can also be used as a tool of bypassing as well. I think we, in general, do things before we're ready. It becomes this kind of performance to look good. You really hurt me, but I don't want to look even worse than I am, so I'm just going to forgive you. I think forgiveness begins with ourselves. And I think that we always skip over ourselves. We're always so concerned about other people. I'm not saying that's wrong. I think that's wonderful. Like, yes, please be concerned about other people, but what does that have to do, this 100% concern for others, what does that have to do with self-preservation and with creating the causes and conditions for us to be preserved in order to do the work of loving and compassion? We don't have to empty ourselves out. We don't have to martyr ourselves. We don't have to crucify ourselves in the name of compassion and love. There's a way in which we're able to offer compassion at the same time we're offering it back to ourselves. We actually begin with ourselves. So forgiveness, therefore, is also first and foremost about the kindness that we offer to ourselves. And saying, it's okay. This is okay that this happened to me. It's okay if I did this. And that opens the door into being with everything as it arises. And I'm not saying that's going to be a comfortable thing. It means that you begin to deal with the reality of the consequences, So there's so much going on, and my first thing on the agenda isn't just to jump into forgiveness. My first thing on the agenda is like, am I taking care of myself? Amen, right? Hallelujah. I think sometimes, particularly it's just the intersections that I occupy as a person of color, a queer person, there's so much pressure on me to forgive people because there's so much denial and regret and grief from those who occupy positions of power that continue to hurt me. And so I'm expected to make those people feel good by forgiving. Like I have to forgive slavery, I have to forgive, well, let's just move to, because, slavery happened in the past, right? So that has nothing to do with what's happening right now. That's sarcasm. That's sarcasm. But, you talk about right now, it's just like, you're expected to do this emotional labor of forgiving when you're the victim because you want people to feel good, So again, always, what do I need? What do I need? Do I need to forgive? Maybe not. Maybe you need to be really pissed off. Maybe you need to take a break. So right now, just thinking about the things that we're all experiencing, just the things that we're trying to hold, it's just kind of like allowing. And you're like, you know what? This is happening. And first and foremost, how do I take care of myself in order to take care of other people? Not how can I take care of other people, then find 5 minutes to take care of myself. Forgiveness also comes with a kind of realizing that people, it was a kind of empathy, and that empathy is actually about realizing that people sometimes are doing the best that they know how to do. Unfortunately, the best that they know how to do sometimes is being really violent. Because they were born into situations and circumstances where, they didn't get what they needed. And then you want to talk about karma, those karmic predispositions and all this kind of stuff too, that also is very much a part of that. Karma is very much a part of all of this. But when I'm, talking to a wider range of people, like people don't really get karma. You all do, so I won't go there, but I'll go to the other side and just say that like sometimes we forget that people have had a whole wide range of experiences before they showed up in front of us, and that maybe what they're doing has nothing to do with us. But we're there and we become targets only because we're there. Not because someone knows us personally, not because they have a personal vendetta, it's because you're a target and you're easy. So that basic empathy, can lead into that forgiveness where you're like, yeah, you're doing the best that you can. That doesn't mean that you won't be held accountable because I think accountability is an expression of compassion, where you're saying that like, I need to be a part of this, or I need to support ways in which I can disrupt your violence. Because the more you engage in this, the more you hurt yourself and the more you're going to hurt other people around you. Not because I'm angry at you and I want you to hurt as much as I hurt. There's a difference between accountability, compassionate accountability, or restorative justice and accountability, opposed to wrath and vengeance. If we're practicing vengeance, then we're just as violent as the person we're reacting to. But maybe that vengeance looks very similar to compassionate accountability, but it's the intention is where that desire is coming from. Do I want you to hurt, or do I want you to be free from suffering? And then you have that together. Maybe you do want someone to be free from suffering. Then that you manifest in a way that may seem violent. And that's the complexity of this as well, that Buddhists are really, we're bad at this whole thing around violence and anger. We're really bad. We oversimplify it. And then people get really mad at me when I tell them that if the revolution hits, I can't really tell you if I won't pick up a gun. Right. I should have came here. It's complex, and it's not about being comfortable with this. It's about being just really disrupted. And the higher you are on this kind of like hierarchy of power and privilege, the more adverse you will be to discomfort. Real adverse, really like, your discomfort, when you're disrupted, that equals violence for other people because you actually don't know how to hold space for that discomfort. So there's a consequence that comes when you begin to enter into the work of disruption within dominant communities. And it's just my personal experience. But love, this is my material for tomorrow, but I'll just briefly say that love, the wish for people to be happy, is such a strong energy that can help us develop agency and to set boundaries, and helps us to make decisions about whose work is it, whose work is it? My job isn't to go around talking about racism and all this stuff. That's not, I didn't sign a contract at the moment of my birth that says, okay, you're going to be talking about racism. Racism isn't my problem. It's not my problem. It creates causes and conditions that I have to struggle with, but it's not my problem. Who else? Who else has something to ask? I get really generous with answers as well. That's a really nice way of saying that I talk too much. I get that from the Theravadins. They're like, oh, you're so generous. Meanwhile, in the Vajrayana groups, we're like, can you be quiet?
Thank you. My name is Bishal. I'm also a student here, a visiting scholar also.
Awesome, welcome.
My question to you, sir, is that when you're starting our entry or starting point, even facing toward Dharma is your own disorienting dilemma. Mm-hmm. And then in the later part, when you get a little bit of relief, then in any case, you'll be moralizing your comfort that you have received, right? But then you will come up with the argument, different way of saying that you have to take care of yourself first. Then only you can help others or something of that sort. How that is related to unbounded compassion, compassion for all sentient beings, coming authentically or utterly coming out of that comfort zone to really help in South Asia, Africa, or anywhere where there is another reality. Could you say something around it with your own experience?
I think that the question being around unbounded compassion, taking care of ourselves, and that kind of dialogue. And I think that, the first thought that I do have is that when we talk about having compassion for all beings, we are all beings. It's not me and then all beings. The way we create this kind of boundary that says okay, over this boundary, this is what I'm actually talking about. But the other end of this boundary where this is a whole nother set of rules. And that's erroneous. That's actually not the correct way of thinking about this. We are all beings. So when I say to have compassion and love for all beings, in my mind, I say, and me. You know, I and all beings deserve to be happy and free from suffering. You know, and then secondly, you know, the unbounded compassion is just so much of the barriers that we experience around that unboundedness is really related to fear. To how fear actually keeps us from moving into the spaciousness. You know, that we stay in the places that we've been put, because what the boundlessness of compassion, love, equanimity, and joy, and all of these really actually are saying is that I will be annihilated. Like this sense of I will be actually deeply challenged once I move into the space of unboundedness. And the ego is terrified of that. You know, to work with that, we actually have to first know and have an awareness of that fear and the terror of the ego. You know, and then gradually we get spaciousness around that, and we gradually move into that more and more. We start letting go more and more. We're not dissolving the ego in any of this. We're just saying that we have a deep fixation. You know, and then we begin to make a home beyond that. We begin to make a home in the disruption of all of that, the discomfort. And we say, oh, this discomfort is exactly where I have to be. You know, but your relationship to discomfort, your relationship to pain, your relationship to suffering changes. So it's not like you're just like, oh, this is so, it's horrible. Like the more compassionate you are, the much more pain you're in. It's actually, that's not really how it goes. You know, it's our relationship to it that begins to change. You begin to see it for what it is. Just this kind of aversion, and the more you relax, the more space opens. You know? And the more we begin to understand that this sense of self is actually the limiting factor in how I'm able to be in the world. You know, so that gradually, as we gradually move into that, we're not doing it in a really unwise or unskillful way. We're doing it really cautiously. We're doing it in a really skillful way. You don't just jump into it. You just don't jump into boundless compassion, because that's idiot compassion. You know, and then you're going to end up actually causing a lot of violence because you haven't negotiated fixation on ego enough. You haven't figured out that relationship enough, you know. So you may think about, oh, I'm going to be really boundless, but if you still have this unconscious fixation to ego and self, then you're going to actually start entering into a great amount of violence against yourself and eventually against others, because if you're connected to ego, fixated on ego, then you're going to hit a boundary. And people will be sacrificed when you hit that boundary. You know, you get to that point where you're like, oh, I can't do this, and people actually start depending on you because you're how people are staying alive. Then all of a sudden, you don't have anything else to give. You're completely wiped out. You're completely exhausted. Or what we would say, you know, in certain circles, you get so emotional exhaustion, fatigue, burnout, yeah, compassionate fatigue. And then you fail people. There's no compassion without wisdom. Yeah, y'all come up, yeah. So you want to have liberatory compassion, you pair it with wisdom. It's two wings of the same bird. Without it, you're just kind of flying lopsided into a wall.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm a first-year MDiv here
at
Naropa.
Wonderful.
It's crazy.
Are you studying Buddhism?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You don't get a choice.
No. So I'm immersed in a culture that is just discovering their white supremacy. And the way that manifests with me is whenever I share my vulnerability, it's really scary for the white people around me. So there's this trying to fix or push back in. So can you speak to something useful I can do to stay in my power, which is my sensitivity, while I'm being pushed up against?
Yeah. Stop taking care of people. I mean, I think you've heard this before. Like you're trying to do all this emotional labor for the oppressor. If I can use that language here, can I? Okay. You just never know. But so for any of us, it's not just about race, but when we're practicing vulnerability and speaking our truth, then we can't prioritize the comfort of other people, because we actually disrupt our truth telling and it becomes a performance. Because it's a performance because we're getting this feedback from the audience and we're adjusting our performance instead of just staying really grounded in our experience and articulating that. Yep. And then people get mad at you. Then people are like, oh, you're like that, whatever it is, and you have to just be okay with that. When I started working with Reverend Angel, we were friends, right? So we were friends and we would hang out, and then we used to, then this book idea and the talks came about, and when we started doing public talks, I would just be like, why are you saying this in public? We just talk about this in private, but you're actually saying it in public. What about other people? People aren't gonna like this. And then what she taught me was actually how to stand in my own truth. That I can't do another person's work. And meaning that I can't really take responsibility. I guess I can't take responsibility for how my basic reality makes you uncomfortable. That actually says much more about you than it does about me. And you can do that in love. You can do that with this lovingness and this kindness, and it's not, and it's not personal. It's just this is what happened to me. This is what I deal with. This is how I feel. This is not about you. It's just about my experience in the world, but you haven't done your work, so you take this personally because you're actually part of the systems that's created this violence for me, and I can't make you feel good about it. So when people come to you wanting you to forgive them, now if they're paying you, that's another thing. You talk about emotional labor. Well, if you can invoice people, then I say I would explore it. Hey,
what's up? Yeah, so I'm Kiva. It's representing Boston over here.
Oh yeah.
So
are you from Boston?
Yeah.
Yeah. What part?
Born and raised Roxbury.
Oh yeah, I was about to say Roxbury.
Yeah, right down the street from Humboldt Ave, Grove Hall.
Yep.
So it may be instructive for people. It would certainly be instructive for me to hear about how this plays out in the Black community in Boston, which is dealing with gentrification, and also, the nature of the city of Boston itself, which is so high-powered in terms of its African ancestry, Crispus Attucks and Malcolm X, and so
Harriet Tubman, and
if you could speak to what this all looks like at that environment.
Yeah, and so when I moved I grew up in the South. I grew up outside of Atlanta. And so when I moved up north, people were just really hating on the South. Like, oh, y'all are so backwards and this and that. And then you get up there and you're like, wait, the same thing's happening here, but you just call it different things. But I don't know about Boulder or Denver really, but same, yeah. So, and then so when you're in these cities, like in Boston, but this is an example of many cities. This is happening in Atlanta as well. But you're in these cities, and we we have to talk about the ways, for me, at least for me, the ways in which we have a tendency of erasing stuff that we don't just want to deal with. And that's what just happens in America. You know, we erase it, we forget about it, you know, and then we lose the history. But you don't lose the trauma. You know, so like you talk about Dudley Square, for instance, like Dudley Square. You know, Dudley Square is like, ooh, it's like the up and coming thing again. It's like, you know, 20 years ago, no one wanted to be there, but all of a sudden, you know, it's like, ooh, you know, it's a really interesting part of town. You know, and then once people of privilege move into a neighborhood, you begin to erase the neighborhood. You begin to erase the culture. You begin to forget that Malcolm X strolled up and down these streets, and MLK and Harriet Tubman, you know. And then we lose something, you know. But I think for people of African descent, people of color, I think that we have to do the work of remembering ourselves, which is why Black Panther is such a thing right now, you know, for many reasons. But it's like the work of remembering. Like we haven't had something to remember us, like in a while, or ever, in a way that this is doing. You know, so if people don't get Black Panther, this is what's happening. We're being reminded of who we are after centuries and centuries of colonization and imperialism and racism and misogyny. Like all of this, we're seeing a vision of ourselves that was taken away from us. Yep. Wakanda or Zamunda. Talks amongst yourselves. If you don't get that, you're not Black. Sorry. Only Black people get that. You know, I know who those people are. You know? But I think it'll be Wakanda. Yeah. But so again, like this idea that like love, I think for me, love enters us into a decolonized future. Real love, love for ourselves, love for others. And this is how we, going back to your question, I think real love is how we begin to navigate these situations where we're being expected to do things, you know, that's not our job to do, you know. But what we can do is reflect love back to people and to allow people to see, you know what, you can do this. You know, you can do this work. I can help you, but I'm limited in the help that I'm going to give you. I can only share my truth, but you have to do the work and sitting with the sadness and the guilt. And you have to understand, you also have to practice futurism as well and dream and love yourself into a way of being that's not violent.
Hello, my name's Sidonia.
Hi, Sidonia.
I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say,
Yeah.
so bear with me. But you mentioned being like a disruption naturally just because of the body you're in. And I'm having this reality since moving to Boulder,
Oh, from where?
North Carolina,
Okay, what part?
Greensboro.
Yeah.
Originally Connecticut, though.
Okay. I have a center in Thomasville.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's not too far, actually. So, and I hear you speaking to how it's okay to actually have those emotions and to deal with the sadness and the anger. And I'm curious to how to understand like what's quote unquote necessary suffering and necessary when dealing with all of this, and what's not, or what's not my part and not my stuff, because it's draining. And you know, you spoke to the emotional labor and knowing that it's not my work to teach or to explain or to do anything, but yet I feel like I'm constantly playing that out. So I don't know if there was a clear question or comment in there, but
I think so. I think so. Yeah. So it's a question of like, how do you figure out how to do how your work? How do you figure out what your work is? You know, I think that is a matter. So you're in the MDiv program. You okay? Okay. Oh, wonderful. You know, probably chances are that you actually learn about Buddhism here. And okay, I don't have that. Okay. I think that first and foremost, it's about turning our attention back to our own experience. You know, and then we explore our own experiences, and then we begin to connect to our own narratives instead of living outside of ourselves. Because I think for some of us, you know, who are of African descent, particularly of slave descent, you know, the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade was actually this really intense traumatic experience. And that traumatic experience completely disrupted our agency to body. And so transhistorical trauma began on the slave ship for us. And then transhistorical trauma has been passed from generation to generation, manifesting mostly in disembodiment. So if you're disembodied, you actually don't know what your narratives are. You don't know what your sensations are. And those sensations often are living outside of the body. You know, so you're like, oh, this is my narrative, this is my work, where in fact, you have to turn back inward and to see where these things are rooted. You go to the root, and then you're like, oh, this is my work because it's rooted here. You know, so you get really selfish. You know, and so the more embodied we get, the more sensitive, of course, we get, you know, but I think the word I'm looking for is more about, so the more embodied we get, the more agency we're able to develop. So the agency is a sense of power that I have over my body, which is, I think, the greatest work for many communities of color is embodiment work. You know, so this, I'm working on my next book too, which is about this, you know, this work of embodiment through the dialogue of love and rage. You know, how do we do the work of being invited back into our whole experience and not living outside of our experience? Once we're grounded there, then we move through the world absolutely knowing what it is ours to do. You know, until then, you're just going to be spending a lot of energy and wasting a lot of energy trying to fix a bunch of stuff around you. You know, systematic work, and so talking about systematics, you know, systematic work is really important, but the systems are mirrored within our own experiences, so we have to disrupt how we are ourselves agents of violence, but also how we're agents of confusion. You know, ourselves, and we need to bring clarity to our own basic situation before we really get involved in addressing the systematic. But of course, we have to do, in most cases, this work at the same time. We're disrupting personal systematic stuff at the same time we're doing the structural systematic work as well. But as you disrupt the personal, you're also disrupting the system as well.
We have time for just one more question.
And a quick answer. So we end at 1:30? Oh, okay, yeah. Come. Hey.
Hi, I'm Danny. Also first year MDiv.
Oh, wow.
I'm wondering, as a practitioner, I mean, as a white male, I frequently engage with other white people about social justice. As a queer person, I am often dealing with homophobia head on and practicing within these forms that Tibetan Buddhism has offered us. And sometimes I have a hard time discerning. I mean, I know your subject is rage and anger, and we're studying, you know, tolerance and patience. So where's the line between, you know, sort of bypassing and just calling my rage this Vajra anger or this and being entitled to my rage, but and you know, I'm not sure how to frame the question, but you know, where does tolerance and passivity fall into just that not wanting to deal with what's right in front of me? I don't know if that made any sense.
Let me give it a shot.
Sure.
So, I shouldn't say this. This is Naropa. Sure. I think the ways in which we use the language of Tantra is problematic sometimes. We try to make it prettier and sacred in a way we haven't earned yet. So this whole idea of Vajra anger, sure it's Vajra anger, but like you're moving into the wisdom aspect of that anger before you've dealt with the violence of it. I think we bypass that experience. I think you have to earn the sacredness of emotions, like anger, before you just jump over it and say, oh, this is Vajra, this is like the manifestation of wisdom, it's a clarifying energy, whatever, the things that we go into, and you have to basically sit and say, this is rage. It doesn't make any sense, necessarily. Sometimes it is directly responding to something, but like sometimes it doesn't make any sense. And just sit with that. Just okay. And yeah, there are all kinds of things that we experience every day, but come home to your basic experience first, which isn't pretty or comfortable or fun or, Buddhist. It is Buddhist. In a way, it is Buddhist, but just coming home to it is just like, okay, this is it. This is the messiness. And then when we begin to metabolize that energy, then it turns into Vajra. You go into the 5 Buddha families, and it becomes expressions of different wisdoms, But you have to earn that right to do that. Yay. Thank you, everyone. This is fun. Yay. Yay.